Good evening from New York. The theory that at least those on the fringes of the kind of political road rage against the 44th president are there because of racism or latent racism or just racial fear may now move to the center of the nation's political discourse. In our fifth story tonight, this after remarks today by former President Jimmy Carter in an interview with Brian Williams for NBC Nightly News. The 39th president who watched his native Georgia grow from lynching and Jim Crow to comparative enlightenment in less than half his own lifetime minced no words about what he sees behind the anger supposedly focused on the issue of health care.
I think an overwhelming portion of the intensely demonstrated animosity toward President Barack Obama is based on the fact that he is a black man, that he's African American. I live in the South, and I've seen the South come a long way, and I've seen the rest of the country that shared this South's attitude toward minority groups at that time, particularly African Americans. That racism inclination still exists, and I think it's bubbled up to the surface because of a belief among many white people, not just in the South but around the country, that African Americans are not qualified to lead this great country. It's an abominable circumstance and grieves me and concerns me very deeply.
I'm joined now by our own Lawrence O'Donnell, contributor to the Huffington Post and, of course, of MSNBC. An overwhelming portion of the intensely demonstrated animosity toward President Barack Obama is based on the fact that he is a black man. Is President Carter correct?
Well, we have had to wonder, especially when we saw Joe Wilson, congressman from South Carolina. I'm not from the South. I'm from the south side of Boston, where I grew up. That was a very racist precinct to be from, and we revealed that when school busing came to our city in 1975. When you hear someone who grew up in the Deep South, as President Carter did, who worked his way into politics in the Deep South, as President Carter did, you have to take this very seriously. The question has been out there about Joe Wilson. Was it really just they need a breathalyzer to allow people onto the House floor, or was there something more serious going on? This is, and I've suggested that the apology he really now needs to make is to the people of South Carolina, many of whom have worked very, very hard to erase the stain of racism from that state, starting with slavery and through segregation. He was alive. He was born into segregation, born into a segregated South Carolina. And so for him to do this, for him to raise this question as he has done, requires at minimum that he apologize to the people of South Carolina who've tried to put this behind them.
Back to President Carter. It is one thing if I were to conclude this, and I have suggested that this may be often true in the most virulent of cases, especially the less rational the surface argument seems to be, the more likely there is that there is another explanation, and unfortunately the natural one would be, given our history, would be this one. It's one thing if you wrote about this or commented about this. What happens if it is a former president of the United States, any former president of the United States, but as you alluded to, particularly this one, who gives voice to this? Well,
this is a real voice of authority, and I think when you look at something like the health care bill, which is, in any version, is going to be over 1,000 pages long. It has many particulars, including tax increases that are specified as tax increases, other things that are called fee increases that you could argue are tax increases. I could go on with substantive arguments that the Republican side of this, our politics, could be making against these bills. And instead, they've been up there trying to slander Barack Obama and talk about death penalty, talk about things that aren't even in the bill because they're afraid of something other than the bill. And that's why when you have someone like Jimmy Carter talking about this from his life experience, this has to be taken very seriously.
When it comes to the town halls and the again, road rage, maybe in fact a pretty good term for it. When it comes to that, and you hear people saying, "I want my America back," very many of these people would actually get something closer to this America back, particularly if health care reform passed and they didn't have to deal with another 12 increases in their insurance premiums between now and the end of this president's term, or whatever the number might be. When it's something like that, are there other explanations for it, or does the idea that there is a racist element of the country, a fear, is that the only explanation, or are there other explanations for this generalized, ill-defined anger?
I don't have another one when I look at the preceding model for this, which was Hillary Clinton's crusade in the same legislative arena. Now, Hillary Clinton was despised by that side of the world as a crazy lefty. They attacked her on policy grounds. They were screaming about the employer mandate. They did not say we want the country back. They weren't saying these same things those 15 years ago on exactly the same subject area. They were actually coming at the bill. Now, in a pretty crude way, but they were talking about the bill. These people have not been talking about what's in the bill. I've never seen that before in opposition to legislation. You oppose legislation by talking about what's in it. They're not talking about that. So what is that motivation?
Could Carter's words, could he carry enough weight to bring this issue into the mainstream of political discussion, and is that a good thing, or will it just polarize people more on this? I
think it's something we have to look at. We have to hold it up and look at it, and maybe look at it for a period of time, maybe a fortnight of thinking about it, and then maybe put it away again for a while. But I've been bothered by some very quick dismissals, for example, at the notion that, oh, no, the Joe Wilson thing was not a racial incident in any way. There were no racial overtones to that at all. And there are some columnists like Maureen Dowd have come out and connected those dots, and then they get sort of criticized as being kind of loony, imaginary, imagining things. No, I think there's something very legitimate to consider, and I think it's incumbent on Joe Wilson to come out and somehow prove to us that this son of South Carolina, born into segregation, grew up in it, that no, he's completely clean on this. I mean, let him come to the podium now. Let him explain to Brian Williams, explain to you, explain to us how we can really be sure that had nothing to do with that moment, and why he might believe that it has nothing to do with the big protest moment we saw, the big protest we've seen out there against President Obama. Yeah,
he would have burst out with that again, same thing against President Hillary Clinton or President John McCain. That's a great point. Lawrence O'Donnell of MSNBC and the Huffington Post, thanks for coming in tonight.